Welcome to season 3, episode 9 of Chebacco Chats. I'm Jenna Jandro, your host today, and I'm speaking to the Historical Society's Executive Director, Raney Bench, about the canneries of Bass Harbor and Southwest Harbor, and what we refer to as the Quietside often. She wrote about this topic in our 2020 edition of Chebacco, which had a theme of imagining what if. So we are using a webinar format today. So while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. So we do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat or the Q&A feature that is at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I will address these questions throughout the chat, so please feel free to ask whenever the inquiry arises. Enjoy my acrobatics as I try to avoid the sunbeam to my right, which I may not be very successful at. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so nope, I always make this one classic mistake. Does everybody want to see? Everybody wants to be shared? Yes, good. Let's play the slideshow. Okay, so I'm excited to welcome, as I said, Raney Bench here today from the MDI Historical Society. And she has spent her career working in small history museums and writing, I might add, and is passionate about making history relevant for her community on MDI. She lives in Southwest Harbor with her husband, 2 sons, and a variety of wonderful household pets. So welcome, Raney. Thank you for being with me here today.
I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to mute myself, but before I do that, I'm going to ask you, regarding your article here, Sounding the Last Whistle, could you please set the scene for us of the working waterfront in Southwest Harbor about the mid-50s?
Yeah, I mean, it's always sort of an evolving space for sure. It's very alive and dynamic. And in the 1950s, the waterfront, we would have a number of large, long piers stretching into the sea, sailboats, fishing boats, recreational boats, all sorts of different kinds of marine watercraft would have been present in that. But dominating the very head of the harbor would be the image that you see here, which was the Addison packing plant. And so this was a very large canning facility, which had docks extending far out into the water where ships could pull in anytime, regardless of the height of tide, to be able to unload catches. And there would be toward the end of the factory's life, in the 80s, large vacuum pumps that would be taking the fish out of the holds of the ships, and then being able to move them through the various buildings that you see there, which had the different steps of manufacturing for the canning process. The large, low building closest to shore, that's sort of a minty green color, all lined with windows, is the packing house floor, which is where the sardines would have been packed. So a lot of noise and activity taking place there. The other rooms in the building would be containing large vats of different types of solutions for processing the fish from coming off the boats. They had to go through and different series of baths. They also had steaming and cleaning facilities for the cans and the canning process, storage facilities, their main office. And then most interestingly, in my mind, one of the stories I loved most in doing this research was about the 5 little red camps that you can see just on shore inland from the boat, which would have been the factory housing. This wonderful painting was done by a local man, How D. Higgins, who actually you can find a number of his paintings in private collections or at the Southwest Harbor Public Library has some. And he painted this probably from a vantage point on Clark Point Road.
Very cool. So we know Southwest Harbor, the waterfront as being a little bit down from Main Street. But what was having an industry like this on the waterfront? How did that impact what was going on in downtown Southwest Harbor? What was it like back then?
Yeah, so there was a lot. I mean, it really employed quite a number of people, and especially in its peak, we had at least 85 packers just working with the fish alone. But in addition to that, there would have been, I'm just trying to look through my article to get a list of some of the different jobs that would have been there, but there would have been shipping agents, people packing and cutting the fish, putting in the different sauces, cleaning, all sorts of different types of activities and jobs, not just on the packing house floor. So probably a couple of hundred people would have been employed by the Addison Packing Company during the 50s and 60s. And so that definitely spilled over into town. We have in my interviews that I conducted a great list of things that were here that Dick Allen, who is now in his 90s, he remembers growing up in Southwest Harbor across from the Addison packing plant. And he said when he was working at Sawyer's Market as a butcher, he remembers that there were 4 grocery stores in the town of Southwest Harbor, 2 clothing stores, a movie theater, a hardware store, and all of them would have been open year round. So it was a much more like year-round community focus for sure, but also it had everything that you might need for your day-to-day life here within the village of Southwest, which is certainly not what we see in any of the villages on MDI anymore.
So this photograph here is a little bit before the era of sounding the last whistle. It's showing kind of early canning, like 1880. And then I have an image here from 1890. And this is also of the William Underwood Company that was at the Steamboat Wharf on Clark Point. This is where the Coast Guard station is kind of located now.
Yes.
Was this the only cannery that was on the island? And how did it stand out among, like, how did MDI play into the larger fish canning industry?
Yeah, so it was definitely not the only cannery. It wasn't even the only cannery in Southwest Harbor. Depending on when you look at various maps or different accounts, there would have been other smaller factories that just sort of pop up and down along Clark Point Road, especially, but also in Manset at various points historically. But certainly Underwood's down at the end at Steamboat Wharf was the biggest and the best established. And it was there, I think, from the 1880s to 1892, and it initially was built to pack beef. And there are early recollections of a cattle drive through downtown Southwest Harbor to take the cattle out to this location to be processed. That didn't last very long for a variety of reasons. And so then more fish packing became the rule and more popular, starting actually with lobster. But it didn't last, again, very long. After the 1890s, the Underwood plant actually was looking to expand because they were so busy and there was so much business. But it was also the point of entry for tourism. So the steamships were coming onto MDI and into Southwest Harbor through this same wharf. And there's a very unflattering description of what it was like to come in at this point in one of the local guidebooks that said, summer tourists who enter Mount Desert by the way of Southwest Harbor are liable to receive very unfavorable impressions of this beautiful island. On landing, an ancient fish-like smell is found to pervade the air around the dock in the vicinity of the lobster boiling establishment, while the general aspect of the place is hardly inviting. So as the company tried to expand, they needed to purchase land from Deacon H.H. Clark, and he had a summer hotel business that was right next door to the plant. So he refused to sell them the land. And there's actually a little bit of conflicting stories about exactly why Underwood's moved, but that's the one that seems to be the most dominant, is that he didn't sell them the land. So they actually moved to Bass Harbor, and this was closed. And there's the facility they opened in Bass Harbor. Really, really different. A very, very modern facility, all brick, filled with lights and windows, and described as being incredibly clean and very, very modern. And so these old canneries that were very important to the development of year-round industry in Southwest and Bass Harbor, I felt had sort of been talked about a lot, and I wanted to do something a little bit different in my research. And so I do talk about the foundation of these two factories and their importance, but I wanted to really look at, if we're going to imagine what if there was still a factory in Southwest Harbor or in Bass Harbor. I felt like the opportunity to interview people who remember what it was like when it was here was too unique to pass up, and a genre of, or an era, I guess, of history, not a genre, an era of history that we haven't really been capturing. And so this article presented an opportunity to do that.
And I found it an incredibly fascinating article to read. I loved your style in presenting what you learned in those interviews. And one thing I learned was that the fish was not kind of imported from very far before it was packaged, and that fishing for it was part of the process. And so we can quickly hear, if you want to go through a little bit about how fishing came before the actual canning, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the packing process was too.
And I just want to give a shout out as we go through this. I had the most incredible opportunity to meet with and learn from locals in Southwest Harbor and Bass Harbor, especially Peter Colson, who was an incredible resource for this article. But the Southwest Harbor Historical Society and the Tremont Historical Society also have really amazing resources available and are caring for collections that inform not only this industry, but the era as well. So just quick shout out to those organizations that I could not have done this article without them. And so this is a weir. So part of the process to be able to, before you could can a fish, you had to catch a fish. And so there were a variety of ways that people were going out and seeking fish. And so weirs were a common method of catching, and all the different ways had pros and cons. So this weir is off Gott's Island, I think, right in between in the pool at Gott's Island. And so what you can see is that as the tide comes in, herring are the fish that are desirable for catching. That's what a sardine is. They come along the coast in big, big, big schools, and they're pretty close to shore. And so as the tide comes in, the herring will enter this sort of circular maze of the weir as a big school, and they come in schooling, and then they can't find their way back out. And so they're stuck in the weir. And then when the fish are in there and the fisherman knows, then he would summon or call. By the time I'm writing this, they're calling the cannery to say, okay, I've got a bunch of fish. So the boats would come out and be able to scoop the fish out of the weir and into the dories in this case, or later into more high-tech fishing boats. And so the benefit of weir fishing was that the fish were contained, obviously, in the weir, but you couldn't can a fish if it had any food in its belly, or the fish would rot. And so by allowing the fish to swim in the weir for a period of time, the fishermen could assure the cannery that there wouldn't be any food in the belly of the fish. And so there was more of a clean product that you could get from this process. And then the boats would come in, they had to fill the holds with fish, obviously. And then this is in McKinley Wharf, Bass Harbor now. And so be able to sleuth either in buckets or through vacuum cleaners later, the fish out of the hold of the boats. And so just I love this, the tide level that's evident in this picture. It's really a very cool picture. So the
Yes.
canneries actually owned the boats that fished for them. So the people who owned the weirs were independent. They did not work for any specific factory, but the factories owned the boats, and they hired the boat captains, and then the captains would hire their crew. And so as the boats went out to fish, the factory manager had to be cognizant of the fact that they had to balance the harvest for each one of the boats. So if one boat was really bringing in a lot of fish, they would the plant manager would call them off the school of fish and bring another boat in, so that all the boats had equal opportunity to be able to harvest, because otherwise the fishermen wouldn't make money. And herring run at night. So this was almost exclusively a nighttime operation that they were fishing.
So these wiggly little fish with no food in their bellies arrive at the packing plant. And then what happens?
Well, as I mentioned, they get sort of sluiced out of the hold of the boat, and they go through a series of like cleaning and brining. So they might get into like a saltwater bath to be able to clean them and brine them, and then they go up to the packing house floor. And there's a series of tables lined up and conveyor belts, or later and earlier, just belts where people would dump the fish on to the line. And you have women on either side of this. And it was a very gender divided industry, where almost exclusively women were cutting the heads and the tails off fish. If that was what was being done, some fish were packed whole. And packing them into cans. And so of all the people I interviewed, this is the most like the piece that really resonates with everyone's memory is the rhythm of the packing house floor. The women would sort of get into this rolling rhythm as they reach forward to pull fish off the line, and they snip and they pack and they reach forward to pull off the line. Sort of, there was such an incredible description of like the grace that took place as they're moving through and packing the fish. And they were incredibly competitive because they were paid by the can. And so they wanted to make sure that whatever fish they could get, they weren't, the person across from them wasn't reaching across this sort of invisible line and taking fish that should have been belonging to this woman, because their income was reliant on it. But despite that competition, and there are reports from almost everyone of getting jabbed with scissors, which were used to snip the fish, there was also many, many more reports of the camaraderie and the joking and the kind of close familial relationships that the people developed on the packing house floor, especially among the women, but also with the men who came to take the flats of cans away to be steamed and sterilized. And then you can see these great pictures from various times of the women working on the packing house floor. And this was really, really important work for women, because there wasn't a lot of job opportunities. By the 50s and 60s, it's getting better, but certainly before that, there weren't as many job opportunities for women, and especially ones that would be local. And so having the ability to be really good at something, to be known to be good at it. Peter Colson mentioned to me that there were a few men who tried to pack fish, but they didn't have the stamina to do it, and they weren't fast enough. And so there's that point of pride among women to be able to have something that men couldn't do. And so it was really important to them, and it gave them much more independence and an economic voice within their family. But it also trickled out beyond just these women working in the factory. Mothers would come in and their daughters would start working there. But also we had stories of when the factory whistle blew, that would signal for the women to come in and start packing fish. Teenage girls knew it was time to babysit. And so they knew from the packing whistle, okay, now I have to go babysit so-and-so's kids, because she's got to go pack fish. And so you sort of have this collective movement of the community surrounding what's happening with the rhythm of the packing plant.
Thank you. And thank you for enduring my super fast slideshow back and forth through the images there. So I meant to also go, let's see if I can get there to this image, which I found while I was prepping for our Chebacco chats today. And it's like a photo that speaks, 1,000 words. So I was excited to include this in our
And it's
in
one
our
I
chat.
hadn't seen before, so it's great. I noticed there's a couple hands coming up in our chat.
Yes, and I have notes for those too. So I was going to save it for
Okay,
a Q&A session, but we can address them now if you'd like.
whatever, perfect. Either way.
Okay, well, let's continue with just this one section here. I think we have two more photos and then we will jump into a Q&A. And
Yeah.
I added these as well because these are in our collection
They
and it
are.
speaks to a very specific challenge that residents of MDI had to face, or visitors who were swimming in MDI waters. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so one of the great stories, and this is what was so fun about talking to people who remember versus reading a historic document, like we could really dig into some things that maybe wouldn't be written down in a diary or make it into a different type of historic record that is older, was so many people remember when the factories were able to dump their byproduct directly into the harbor. And so both the Addison packing plant in Southwest Harbor and the Underwood packing plant in Bass Harbor packed fish differently. And so in Bass Harbor, they were packing fried fish in oil. And so their byproduct was a huge amount of oil that was dumped directly into the bay at the end of each day. And Muriel Davison remembers as a kid, the high tide line around the interior of Bass Harbor was a slick of oil from the cannery, and how careful the kids had to be scrambling over that really slippery tidal zone to be able to get into the water to swim. And in Southwest Harbor, they were packing the fish in mustard, hot sauce. You can see here tomato sauce, a lot of different other types of products within the fish to season it and flavor it. And so Marjorie Raskin remembered when she was working there in the 70s, and even before that, her parents, Ralph and Marion Stanley, have a place on Clark Point Road. They would immediately know what was being packed that day by the color of Southwest Harbor. It would be yellow if they'd been packing in mustard, as the mustard gets dumped into the harbor, or red if they've been packing in tomato sauce. And so it colored, the pollution colored the water. But they also remember there were a lot more scavengers and fish, aquatic fish life that were there, that were coming in to the harbor to eat the byproduct that was coming out of the canneries. And so they would go and fish for flounder and for sculpin and all sorts of different things. And there were shorebirds that were feeding on the fish. And so they sort of had this memory of the pros and cons of being able to dump the byproduct directly into the water. But obviously environmental concerns in the 60s and 70s would have started cleaning that part of the process up.
So that isn't responsible at all for why the canneries ended up closing. Were there a series of factors? What caused the sounding of the last whistle?
Yeah, so it was a series of factors, and a lot of it was changes in dietary trends. And so people were less interested in eating fish packed in oil, especially, or oily products. The international market for food had really opened up by the 1980s. And so there was just a lot of shifting in what people wanted to consume. And at the same time that we have sort of a shifting market for these products, we see a crash in the herring population corresponding with that. And so there's not as many fish available. So fleets are having to go further and further offshore or up and down the coast to be able to harvest the herring, which is more in gas money and harder on the crews to be able to go long distances. both Addison and Underwood tried to resolve these problems in different ways. The Addison packing plant in Southwest Harbor was bringing in frozen fish product from Portugal that was then brought in to pack here, but it just wasn't sustainable. They also had fishing fleets in Massachusetts and southern Maine and New Hampshire that were trying to bring fish up to these packing plants here and in Winter Harbor to try to keep those going. But it just, between the economic collapse of the interest of the market and the more expense it was to bring the fish products in, it just didn't work. And then for the Underwood factory, they actually tried to switch to pie fillings. So they were canning blueberries and canned cherries and other kinds of pie fillings. But there just wasn't the same kind of market to sustain that either. And so here you see sort of the end, not even, actually, this isn't at the end, in the 60s. This is about 20 years before the end of the Addison packing plant. This is from the head of Southwest Harbor looking out to the Cranberry Isles. And so you can see the packing house. And this is now where Dysarts is. And you can still go down to that marina. It's below, there's a restaurant up there, the upper deck. And then to the left, the road that goes down is the road that would have been all of the packing plant.
Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because that's the end of the slideshow. That was very cool. I'm very glad that we don't have to swim around in tomato juice and mustard, even though I don't think too many people are swimming. We at least don't have to deal with that anymore. So do you have a few more moments, Raney? Because we're up at 5 o'clock, but I have probably a couple of questions because I saw some hands being raised.
Yeah,
great.
absolutely.
So I'm going to try this fun little feature where they say you can allow someone to talk. Have you done this before?
No.
Me neither. Okay, so I believe I saw Holly and Tom Hayward. Okay, so Tom Hayward is the first on my list here. I'm going to go allow to talk. There's Tom. Tom, if you're there, could you unmute and give your question or comment? And if not, we'll give you 15 seconds and then we'll try the next person with their hand raised.
People can also put stuff in the chat too.
Yes. Oh, there he is. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Hi, Raney.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Jenna. My question was that, and by the way, my chat, when I link on it, it says it's disabled. So I wasn't able to put this in. But Raney, when you were talking about the importance of scissors to those women, the first thing I thought of was the importance of scissors in the cotton looms when we lived in Lewiston. And that some older gentlemen lived across the street from us, and they were both worked in the cotton looms, or on the cotton looms in Lewiston at Bates Mill and another mill. And one of the older gentlemen required that he be buried with those scissors, and he was. I made sure that happened. Was there the same relationship between those women and their particular pair of scissors, or how important was that as a tool for their success?
Great question. And it was super important. We had a lot of people talk about the fact that they did have to provide their own scissors and their own aprons. And they had these little ways of creating protection on their fingers that allowed dexterity and precise movement as well. And their stools, they talked a lot about the stools that they had to sit on, and that, they liked it in a certain position or a certain height or a certain padding. And so absolutely, those scissors were a very important part in making sure that they were really sharp, so that they were very, very efficient at being able to snip the fish quickly and cleanly was an important part of it. And I will note that Jenna showed some of the collections that we have that are the canned products, but we don't have any of those other examples of material culture related to the cannery. And I asked everyone I interviewed, do you have your scissors? Do you have your your hairnet or your aprons. And unfortunately, no one has them anymore.
Oh, oh,
Yeah.
that's too bad. Well, and in fact, how did the cannery in Southwest Harbor get the name Beach, Beach, Cliff? How did that name come out? Because it's not the way the landmarks are spelled.
So that company, so Addison was the packing plant in Southwest, but it was part of a larger company called the Stinson packing plant, and they had plants all up and down, including the largest one that closed at the last one to close was in Winter Harbor. So they had products that they created in like product lines under 5 or 6 different names. And so that's just one name of a product line that was produced and canned in Southwest Harbor, but it was not like it wasn't originated or branded here. It would have come from
Okay.
the larger corporate office.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll mute again. Yeah.
Thanks, Susan.
All
And
right.
I just allowed to talk, which sounds like I have so much power. Jeffrey Dunn. Did you have a question or a comment?
I have 2 quick questions. One, did I miss what year they stopped canning the fish in Southwest Harbor? And secondly, are there any canneries anywhere left in Maine today?
So Addison closed the Southwest Harbor plant in 1987. And no, there are no longer any canneries in Maine today. So the really thriving canning communities in Lubec and Eastport both actually lost all of their canneries certainly before the one in Winter Harbor, which was the last cannery in the state. And that closed in 2010.
Okay, thank you. So unless there's any other questions, oh, I have Jared Roberts. Go ahead, Jared.
Can you hear me?
Sure can.
I visited the Peacock canning factory in Lubec in the 1960s and was talking briefly to one of the women who was sitting and cutting the heads and tails off. And I asked her how the sardines were running this year. And she said, the herring are running good. And I said, I thought innocently, I thought this was sardines. And she said to be herring in the sea, sardines in the can. Is that in fact where sardines come from? We think of sardines are actually just small herring?
Yep, that's exactly right. And that was something really interesting that I learned in this process too, that there aren't, what we would call sardines that are canned are actually herring. They can also be like small mackerel were also canned, but they were labeled as mackerel. And then I feel like Peter told me there was one other fish that went once it was packed by the name of sardine, but primarily they were herring that were being canned. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I don't know why the name changes from herring to sardine, but it just does.
Well, thank you everyone for those great questions. We're going to finish up now. If there's none others and I don't see any more raised hands, I think we're all set, and I will finish with a couple matters of business. Raney, I do want to say thank you so much for an incredibly interesting topic, and for being a gracious guest as I played with a lot of different things in technology world. I do want to say next week we're going to be back at 4:30 on Thursday, and I will be joined by Patrick Calloway. He was an author in this volume of Chebacco as well, and he is our collections manager at the MDI Historical Society. He'll be speaking about British plans for Down East Maine in 1775 to 1815. He's pretty much the expert on this kind of topic. And if you want to view Chebacco Chats after they air, they're available on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And you can get a copy of Chebacco anytime by sending us an email or ordering one on our website. But also, if you're a member, you get a copy of Chebacco every year. We're already starting to think of topics for Chebacco 2024, which is awesome. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.